Somewhere in California right now, families are buying bottled water because arsenic is coming from their taps. A town is sinking 11 feet into the earth because the groundwater beneath it was pumped dry, and home values are following the water down. These are 10 California cities where the water crisis is getting worse. Number 10, Coalinga. Pull up Coalinga on Google Maps in Fresno County and look at where it sits, because the first thing you will notice is that there is no river running through it, no lake beside it, and no obvious source of water anywhere near it. Coalinga gets its water through the California Aqueduct, which pumps it from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta over 200 miles away through one of the most expensive and energy-intensive water delivery systems ever built. That system was designed in the 1960s when California had half the population it has now, and the climate was more predictable, and the assumption was that Northern California would always have enough water to share. Every one of those assumptions is being tested right now. The aqueduct that feeds Coalinga runs through the San Joaquin Valley, where the ground is sinking from overpumping and the canal itself is losing capacity because the sinking land is creating dips that reduce how much water it can carry. State officials estimate that if subsidence continues at its current rate, aqueduct deliveries could drop by 87% by 2043. Coalinga has about 17,000 people, median home prices around $210,000, and an economy built on agriculture and oil extraction. When the water allocation gets cut, the farms scale back, and when the farms scale back, the jobs disappear, and when the jobs disappear, the people follow. A town that depends on water pumped from 200 miles away through a canal that is sinking into the ground is a town living on borrowed time and borrowed water. Guys, please like this video and subscribe to this channel because this really helps me to reach more American people. Number 9, Mendota. Search Mendota, California on Google Maps about 35 miles west of Fresno, and you will find a town that calls itself the cantaloupe capital of the world. Except the cantaloupes are not growing like they used to because the water that grew them is not arriving like it used to. About 12,000 people live in Mendota, and most of them work in agriculture or in jobs that exist because agriculture exists. And when drought hits and water allocations get cut, this town does not just slow down, it collapses. During the drought of 2014 to 2016, unemployment in Mendota exceeded 40%, not because people stopped wanting to work, but because the fields they worked in turned brown and the jobs evaporated with the water. Families lined up at food banks in a town surrounded by some of the most productive farmland on earth, because the land was productive only when it had water, and the water was gone. Median home prices in Mendota sit around $230,000, and the real estate market moves with the water cycle in a way that would make any investor uncomfortable, because a wet year brings jobs and optimism, and a dry year brings unemployment and for sale signs. The cantaloupe capital of the world is a town where the title on the welcome sign depends entirely on whether the canal has water in it this season. Number 8, Teviston. You will not find much about Teviston on Google Maps because it is an unincorporated community in Tulare County with about 1,400 people, most of them farm workers who pick the crops that end up in grocery stores across America. Teviston has no city government, no tax base, no municipal water system of its own, and for many residents, the concept of reliable running water has never been a guarantee. Not because they live in some remote mountain outpost, but because they live in an unincorporated community that falls through the gaps between county and state responsibility, where nobody is clearly in charge of making sure the water works. Some homes in Teviston have been dealing with dry or contaminated wells for years, and the response from the state has been slow, because when your community does not have a city council or a mayor or a seat at the table where water decisions are made, your community gets what is left over, and sometimes what is left over is nothing. Residents depend on bottled water deliveries and emergency tank fills provided by state programs that were designed to be temporary, but have quietly become permanent because nobody has built a permanent solution. The median household income in Teviston is well below the poverty line, and the idea of drilling a deeper well at $30,000 to $50,000 per well is not a conversation most families here can afford to have. Teviston is what happens when the water crisis meets the poverty crisis in the same zip code, and nobody with the power to fix either one is paying enough attention to know this place exists. Number 7. Tulleville. About 10 miles north of Teviston in the same county is Tulleville, another unincorporated farm worker community with roughly 350 people and a water situation that sounds made up until you realize it has been documented by state agencies and news organizations for years. Tulleville sits right next to the city of Exeter, which has clean, reliable municipal water, but when Tulleville asked to connect to Exeter's system, the request was denied, and the reason came down to cost and jurisdiction and the politics of who is responsible for whom. So 350 people living within sight of a city with perfectly good water continue to rely on wells contaminated with nitrates from decades of agricultural runoff, while their neighbors a few hundred yards away turn on their taps without a second thought. The state has provided emergency bottled water and tank deliveries, but connecting Tulleville to a permanent clean water source has been stuck in bureaucratic and political limbo for years, with funding gaps and jurisdictional disputes keeping 350 people on the wrong side of an invisible line that determines whether your water is safe or poisoned. That invisible line is not geographic, it is political. It separates a city from an unincorporated community, and on one side the water is clean, and on the other side the water has nitrates in it. And the distance between the two sides is measured not in miles, but in municipal boundaries that nobody thought to redraw. Tulleville is one of the starkest examples of water inequity in California, because the water exists, the infrastructure exists, and the solution exists, but the 350 people who need it cannot access it because of a line on a map. Number 6. Kettleman City. Search Kettleman City on Google Maps in Kings County along Interstate 5, about halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, in a stretch of the Central Valley that most drivers pass through at 80 miles per hour without giving it a second thought. About 1,500 people live here, and most of them are farm worker families who settled in Kettleman City because the rent was cheap and the fields were close, and nobody told them what was sitting on the other side of the hill. What makes this town different from every other water-stressed community on this list is what sits next to it. Because the Kettleman Hills facility is one of the largest hazardous waste dumps in the western United States, handling toxic materials from across California and dumping them within miles of a town where children play outside. For years, residents reported elevated rates of cancer and birth defects, and in 2010, state investigators found a cluster of birth defects among babies born to Kettleman City mothers that prompted an official health review. The water in Kettleman City has tested positive for arsenic and benzene at levels that exceed safe drinking water standards. And while the state has funded water treatment improvements, the process has been painfully slow, and the trust between residents and authorities was broken long before the improvements began. Home values in Kettleman City are among the lowest in the state, and the reason is not complicated, because nobody is lining up to buy property next to a toxic waste dump in a town where the water tests positive for arsenic. Kettleman City is where California sends its garbage and its hazardous waste, but cannot seem to send clean drinking water. Number 5. Salton City. Pull up the Salton Sea on Google Maps and zoom in on the western shore in Imperial County, and you will see the remains of what was supposed to be California's Riviera. In the 1950s and 60s, developers built yacht clubs, marinas, and resort communities around the Salton Sea, selling the dream of a Palm Springs on the water. Salton City was one of those communities, and for a while, the dream worked. Families bought lots, boats appeared on the water, and the desert bloomed with money and optimism. Then the sea started dying. The Salton Sea has no natural outlet, and as agricultural runoff that fed it was reduced. the water level began dropping. As the shoreline receded, it exposed a lake bed thick with pesticide residue, selenium, and other toxins that had accumulated over decades of agricultural drainage. The exposed lake bed dries out, and wind picks up the toxic dust and carries it into the lungs of the 6,000 people who still live in Salton City and surrounding communities. The area has some of the highest childhood asthma rates in California. Home prices in Salton City have effectively collapsed, with properties that were once listed in the hundreds of thousands now selling for $30,000 to $60,000, and some sitting on the market for years. The yacht clubs are ruins. The marinas are dry. The water that remains is saltier than the Pacific Ocean and smells like decay on hot days. California built a resort on a dying lake, and the lake is now poisoning the people who could not afford to leave. Number 4. Seville. Another unincorporated Tulare County community with about 350 people, and a water problem that would be hard to believe if state testing had not confirmed it repeatedly over multiple years. Seville's drinking water has tested positive for nitrates and arsenic, both linked to serious health problems, including cancer and developmental issues in children. The source is agricultural runoff from the fields that surround the community, the same fields where many Seville residents spend their days picking crops that end up in grocery stores in cities where people have never heard of Seville and never will. The irony is as sharp as anything on this list, because the people who grow California's food cannot safely drink the water in their own homes, and nobody outside of Tulare County seems to find that unacceptable. State agencies have distributed emergency bottled water and made promises about permanent solutions, but progress has been blocked by funding gaps, infrastructure challenges, and the political invisibility that comes with being an unincorporated community of 350 people, with no mayor, no city council, and no voice loud enough to be heard over the noise of a state that has 39 million other residents competing for attention. Median household income in Seville is well below the state average, and buying a water filtration system or drilling a new well is financially impossible for most families here. Home values reflect the situation. Properties in Seville sell for prices that would not buy a parking space in San Francisco. In the richest state in the richest country on earth, 350 people are buying bottled water because arsenic is coming from their taps, and the fields that put it there are the same fields that employ them. Number 3. Needles. Open Google Maps and search Needles, California in San Bernardino County on the Arizona border, and look at how far it is from everything, because the nearest city of any size is Las Vegas, 100 miles north, and the nearest California city of any consequence is Barstow, 150 miles west. About 5,000 people live in Needles, which regularly records the highest temperatures in California, hitting 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer and earning a reputation as one of the hottest cities in the United States. Needles sits directly on the Colorado River, the same river at the center of your Arizona water crisis, and the same river that Lake Mead depends on, and Lake Mead is currently at about 34% capacity. The Colorado River supplies water to 40 million people across 7 states, and that supply is being renegotiated right now, with the current operating rules expiring at the end of 2026. Arizona already faces an 18% cut, and California's allocation is expected to be reduced in the new agreement. Needles being on the river does not guarantee safety, because allocation is not the same as access, and when the rules change, the smallest cities at the end of the pipeline feel it first. Home prices in Needles sit around $175,000 to $225,000, which sounds cheap until you factor in electric bills that can exceed $500 a month in summer, because air conditioning is not a luxury here. It is survival. The hottest city in California, sitting on a river that 40 million people are fighting over, while scientists debate how many decades it has left, is not a comfortable place to sign a 30-year mortgage. Number 2. Porterville. Search Porterville, California on Google Maps in Tulare County, about 50 miles southeast of Fresno, and you will find a city of 60,000 people that became a national symbol of California's groundwater failure. During the drought years, hundreds of domestic wells in and around Porterville went completely dry, leaving families without running water for weeks, then months, then in some cases, over a year. Families skipped showers, washed dishes with collected rainwater, drove to relatives' houses to bathe, and bought bottled water for cooking and drinking. The state eventually declared a drinking water emergency and spent over $30 million connecting the hardest hit areas in East Porterville to the city's water system. But the project took years, and during those years, families lived in homes with no functioning taps in a state that has the 5th largest economy in the world. The wells went dry because agricultural pumping had drawn the water table down so far that domestic wells, which are typically shallower than agricultural wells, simply could not reach it anymore. The bigger straws drained the water from beneath the smaller ones. Median home prices in Porterville sit around $270,000, but in the areas most affected by the well crisis, values dropped significantly, and some properties became essentially unsellable because no buyer wants a house where the well went dry once and could go dry again. Porterville is not a small, forgotten community. It is a city of 60,000 people, and the water still failed. And that is what makes it terrifying, because if it happened here, it can happen anywhere in the Central Valley. Number 1. Corcoran. Search Corcoran, California on Google Maps in Kings County in the southern San Joaquin Valley, and what you will see from satellite view looks like a normal small city of about 22,000 people surrounded by irrigated farmland. But what you cannot see from space is that the entire town is sinking. Over the past 14 years, Corcoran has dropped as much as 11.5 feet in some areas, enough to swallow the entire first floor of a 2-story house, making it one of the fastest sinking places in the United States according to the U.S. Geological Survey. The ground is collapsing because agricultural companies have been pumping groundwater from deep beneath the valley for decades, and when that much water is removed, the soil and clay above it compress into the empty space like a sponge being squeezed flat. The San Joaquin Valley has lost roughly 41 cubic kilometers of groundwater since 1980, enough to fill Lake Tahoe entirely. The Corcoran Levee, which protects the city from flooding, has been rebuilt multiple times because it keeps sinking below safe levels, and each rebuild costs millions, and each time the ground pulls it back down. The California Aqueduct, which delivers water to 27 million people, is losing capacity because the sinking land creates dips that restrict flow, and a 2025 state report estimated that if subsidence continues, the aqueduct could lose 87% of its delivery capacity by 2043. Median home prices sit around $200,000, but the value of a home in a town that is physically sinking is a question real estate has never had to answer, because what does a foundation mean when the ground beneath it has already fallen 11 feet and shows no sign of stopping? Corcoran's water was pumped out so aggressively that the ground followed the water down. That is not just a water crisis. That is gravity collecting a debt California has been running up for decades, and the ground is still sinking. 10 cities drying up and home values following the water down. A canal sinking from 200 miles away. Arsenic in the taps. A resort turned toxic. The hottest city on a dying river. 60,000 people whose wells went dry. And a town sinking 11 feet into the earth. Which city shocked you most? Comments below. Subscribe. See you in the next one.